I always thought love stories were loud and obvious, written in grand gestures and cinematic moments, but apparently mine was buried in the quiet spaces between friendship and unspoken feelings. Because when my best friend Ethan asked me to look after his girlfriend Lily while he worked overseas for a year, I agreed without hesitation, never imagining that assignment would become the most emotionally confusing time of my life. And I still remember the day he left, the airport humming with last-minute announcements and rushed goodbyes, as he hugged me tightly and told me to keep an eye on her, as if she were his most precious treasure. And honestly, I thought she was, because Lily had this warmth that made people feel seen, a brightness that could cut through the worst days. So I took the responsibility seriously, making sure she never felt alone, checking up on her when storms rolled in, walking her home from late shifts, sitting beside her in quiet coffee shops when the silence of missing him got too heavy. And over time, our bond grew naturally, pieces of our personalities clicking together in ways I never anticipated, like how she knew exactly when to crack a joke to pull me out of my head, or how I always remembered to bring her favorite strawberry gummies before movie nights. And at first, I chalked it up to friendship, loyalty, the kind of closeness built from mutual care while waiting for someone we both loved to return. But somewhere between the laughter under streetlights and the long talks on park benches when we were both exhausted from pretending everything was fine, something shifted. Subtle, but undeniable, because she began looking at me with a softness I didn't understand, lingering glances that felt like questions neither of us dared answer. And one night when the city was quiet and the world smelled like rain, she confessed that sometimes she forgot he was the one she was waiting for. And I didn't know what to say, my chest tightening with confusion and guilt, and something dangerously close to hope. So I just told her that we both cared about him and that his return would make everything clear again. But the truth is I couldn't sleep after that, because her voice haunted me, her vulnerability burrowing into a place I didn't know existed inside me. And I started noticing things I shouldn't have, how my heart raced when she smiled at me, how her laugh sounded sweeter than any music, how every goodbye felt wrong, like I was stepping away from something I didn't want to lose. Yet I reminded myself she wasn't mine and never would be, because she loved Ethan and he loved her, or so I thought. And all I could do was wait with her, pretend my feelings were only friendship while months passed like slow-moving clouds across the sky. And she would send him photos of us together, telling him stories of our days as if she were documenting proof that we were doing exactly what he asked, looking out for each other, staying connected to him, keeping this trio intact. But eventually, the countdown ended, and the week before he returned, Lily seemed restless, constantly fidgeting with her phone, eyes filled with a nervous energy that made me think she was finally overwhelmed with excitement to see him again. And I told myself I should be happy for them, that this was how things were always meant to go, that I had simply been a placeholder in the empty space he left behind. But the night before he arrived, she hugged me longer than ever, her voice soft against my shoulder as she whispered that she hoped I wouldn't disappear now that he was coming back. And I didn't understand why she sounded almost scared, but I promised I wasn't going anywhere, even though part of me feared that would be a lie I'd be forced to tell. And when the day finally came, Ethan walked into the arrival hall with that familiar bright grin, his arms wide open, and Lily rushed to him with tears of relief, the kind that come from surviving something hard. But then she stepped aside, wiped her eyes, and looked at me with the calmest smile, telling him that she had kept her promise, that she made sure he didn't forget me. And I blinked in confusion until Ethan turned to me, eyes shining with something raw and long hidden. And in that heartbeat, everything I had misunderstood collapsed into place like puzzle pieces finally revealing the full picture, because he walked past her and hugged me, full and desperate and trembling. And when he whispered, "I never stopped loving you," my entire world cracked open, every assumption shattered, every moment with Lily redefined, and I realized too late that the love story I thought I was helping to protect was actually the one I had unknowingly belonged to from the very beginning. I couldn't breathe for a moment, not because the airport was loud or crowded, but because the truth hit me with such force that it knocked the air right out of my lungs. And as Ethan held me, clinging like I was the one constant in a life that had finally stopped spinning, I stood frozen, disbelief flooding every corner of my mind, because I had spent months helping the girl who wasn't the main character in his story. She was the bridge connecting two people who belonged to each other and didn't even know it. And when he finally pulled back to look at me, his eyes glimmering with relief like he had been drowning and only now surfaced, I felt guilt crash over me like a tidal wave. Guilt for every moment with Lily that had felt too intimate, too selfish, too close to something that wasn't mine to feel. And Lily must have sensed the panic building inside me, because she stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on my arm, grounding me as she said that she knew, that she had always known, long before she ever said it out loud, that his heart was tied to mine in ways she could never compete with. And I stared at her in bewilderment, because how could she say that so calmly after everything we shared? Late night tears, laughter until our stomachs hurt, the silent gazes we pretended not not to notice, but she smiled, soft and a little sad, and explained that every time Ethan called her, eventually the conversation always returned to me. Every memory he shared had my name stitched into it. Every piece of his excitement, his fears, his dreams were all built with me standing right next to him. And still, I was too blind to recognize that the love I had convinced myself to bury for years had been mutual all along, tangled up in hesitation and fear that we both pretended wasn't there. And I hated how many times I could now look back and see it so clearly. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, how he always defended me with too much passion, how every goodbye lingered longer than necessary, like we were both silently begging time to slow down. But I shoved those memories into the corners of my mind so I wouldn't ruin what he had with Lily, thinking she was the one he chose, the one he truly wanted. Yet here she stood, telling me that she had only been holding his place in my life, not the other way around, that the only promise she ever made to him was to make sure I stayed in his heart no matter how far away he went, because he was terrified I would drift out of his life and find someone else before he could come back. And even though she said it kindly, like this was all some beautifully planned reunion, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that settled in my chest, knowing feelings weren't so easily compartmentalized. Because Lily was not some prop in our story. She was real. She cared. She had been there when he wasn't. And part of me wondered painfully if she had developed her own feelings for me, because I remembered that night under the streetlights, the trembling in her voice, the way she almost leaned in closer, and I couldn't decide if that was love misplaced or longing redirected. But there was a truth that none of us could deny anymore. The line between loyalty and desire had blurred long before this moment, and now we were standing at the crossroads with a future none of us had fully prepared for. And Ethan must have noticed the worry shadowing my expression, because he took my hand like he used to when we were young, before he left, before everything got complicated. And he told me that the only reason he ever dated Lily was because he thought I didn't feel the same, that he couldn't bear the loneliness of loving me from a distance when I looked so happy without him. And Lily laughed, not bitter, but with a hint of irony, as she admitted she always knew she was living with borrowed affection, that she saw the missing piece in every touch, every kiss, every moment that should have felt like love, but tasted like longing for someone else. And yet she stayed, not out of desperation, but because she believed that if two people were meant for each other, the world would find a way to pull them together eventually. And standing there in that airport, I finally understood that she had been the quiet architect of our reunion, the protector of a love she never got to truly keep. And I didn't know whether to thank her or apologize for the pain she must have swallowed along the way. But before I could say anything at all, she squeezed my hand and whispered that she was letting go because she wanted all three of us to be free, them from pretending and me from denying what I had always felt. And as I looked between the two people who had held so much of my heart in different ways, I realized that this moment was not a dream or some confusing blur of impulsive emotions, but a turning point where I finally had to decide whether I would keep running from the truth or finally step into the love that had been waiting for me all along. Ethan's fingers tightened around mine, not possessive, yet terrified, like he thought I might slip away if he loosened even a little. And the fear in his touch told me more than any confession could, because this was the boy who used to leap from cliffs into the lake without hesitation, the boy who once announced he was moving overseas with a recklessness that masked his heartbreak. And seeing him afraid, of me, of us, of timing, forced my heart to thud painfully against my ribs. But before I could say anything to reassure him, Lily stepped back just far enough to give us space, her expression composed, yet undeniably fragile, as if she were holding herself together with invisible thread. And I finally spoke, my voice rough and unsure, asking why no one told me the truth sooner, why we had to arrive at this moment with secrets and sacrifices trailing behind us like ghosts. But Ethan only exhaled shakily and said that sometimes love grows crooked when fear gets in the way. And I realized how many years we had wasted tiptoeing around each other's hearts, building walls around feelings that should have been shared, not hidden, because I remembered every almost confession that fizzled out into nervous laughter, every lingering touch cut short before it could mean too much, every moment we stood on the edge of something real and chose to step back. And now the consequences of that silence stood beside us. Lily, who had loved without ever being fully loved in return, who carried Ethan's happiness in one hand while holding her own heartbreak in the other. And the weight of that sacrifice made me feel unworthy of both of them. Yet Lily simply nodded as if she understood every thought swirling inside me, telling me that if love is real, it survives the mistakes, the distance, the bad timing, because real love waits. But she also warned that it does not wait forever, that we were lucky the clock had not run out, and I wanted to ask her how she could be so strong while losing what she once hoped might grow into something more than borrowed affection. But she didn't let me, instead meeting Ethan's gaze one last time with gratitude for what they had shared, pain for what they could never be, and permission for him to finally take the step he had been too afraid to take. And when she turned to leave, the crowd swallowed her quickly, like the world didn't want to give us time to regret anything. And suddenly it was only Ethan and me standing there with years of longing pressed into the inches between us, his thumb brushing over my knuckles like he was memorizing the shape of something he thought he had lost forever, and I felt my defenses crumbling, everything I had buried resurfacing in a rush so strong I nearly staggered. Because yes, I loved him, maybe always had, and the desire to finally admit that burned like wildfire through me. But I knew love born from someone else's heartbreak came with consequences, so when Ethan whispered that he came home for me, not the country, not his job, not even his family, I choked on the enormity of it, overwhelmed by the realization that every call, every message, every story about his life out there was a thread pulling him back to me. And I wondered if I had been selfish, pretending I didn't feel the pull too. But before doubts could twist deeper, Ethan reached up and touched my cheek, gentle, hopeful, trembling. And in that single touch, I felt the years between us collapsing, felt the truth neither of us could run from anymore. And as he leaned in just close enough that I could feel his breath against my lips, he asked me if I wanted this, if I wanted him, if I was ready to stop pretending. And the noise of the airport faded. Time slowed, and everything I once feared became irrelevant, because my heart answered before my voice did, and I realized that this was not the beginning of something new, nor the return to something old, but the continuation of a story that had always been ours, waiting patiently for us to finally choose it. We left the airport without a destination, without a plan, without even really speaking, because our hands stayed linked, and that said more than words could. And Ethan drove like he was afraid of blinking and losing me, glancing over every few seconds just to make sure I was still there, still real, still choosing him. And I kept staring out the window trying to calm the chaos inside me, because joy and guilt and disbelief were all colliding in my chest, especially when I thought of Lily, the girl who stepped aside with grace I did not deserve, because no matter how sweet this moment felt, it was born from heartbreak, and I couldn't ignore that. But when we stopped at the old diner we used to practically live in after school, Ethan parked, then just sat there gripping the steering wheel like he was bracing for impact, telling me quietly that if I regretted whatever this was becoming, he needed to know now, before he let himself fall any deeper than he already had. And that terrified me, because I did not want to hurt him, not after all the years we wasted staying silent. So I told him the truth, the whole truth, that I had loved him long before Lily, long before we knew what love could cost. And his breath caught like my confession physically hit him, his eyes bright with something raw and unguarded, and he leaned in as though he might kiss me right there. But instead, he rested his forehead against mine, whispering that if he kissed me now, he would never stop, and he wanted to do this right, wanted our first real moment to be something we never had to question later. So we went inside, and everything looked the same. The cracked red vinyl booths, the faded photographs of smiling strangers on the walls, the jukebox that ate quarters and only played static some days. And the familiarity made it easy to slip back into who we used to be, two kids who believed the future was a puzzle they'd figure out together someday. Except now, we were no longer guessing, we were choosing, and that felt infinitely heavier. Because after we ordered our usuals without even needing to look at the menu, Ethan reached across the table and held my hand openly, not caring who saw. And the simplicity of that gesture almost unraveled me, because this was everything I used to dream about, and it was happening in the middle of fluorescent lights and sticky tabletops, instead of some grand romantic moment. But reality is messy, and love that survives timing and distance doesn't need perfection. And yet the question neither of us dared speak hovered between us. What happens now? Because Lily's absence was not permission, it was the result of pain. And even though Ethan promised he had ended things cleanly and honestly, some part of me feared the cracks would eventually show, that the ghosts of what he and Lily had might follow us. And I confessed that fear to him in a trembling whisper, but he squeezed my hand and smiled in that quiet, steady way he always did when he made a decision he intended to keep, telling me that he was done living halfway, done loving halfway, done choosing safety over truth, and that from this moment forward, he wanted everything with me. No hiding, no maybe someday, no almost, while his thumb traced circles against my skin like he was drawing a future there. And for the first time since he returned, the hope swelling inside me wasn't tangled with dread, because I realized Ethan wasn't asking me to forget what it cost to get here. He was asking me to believe that we could make it worth the cost, that love doesn't always come clean and easy. Sometimes it arrives bruised but unbreakable. And as the server brought our food and Ethan let go of my hand reluctantly, the faint smile on his lips made a promise that I felt deep in my bones. We were finally starting the story we should have begun years ago, and I wasn't going to let fear steal it from us again. When we finished eating, neither of us hurried to leave because the air around us felt different now, charged with a new awareness that had been waiting years to exist, and every tiny moment felt heavier than it should. Like the way Ethan brushed a crumb from the corner of my mouth, his fingers lingering a second too long, or the way his foot kept grazing mine under the table like he couldn't stand any distance between us. And when we finally stepped out into the night, the city lights flickered against the dark sky, and the world seemed strangely quiet, as if it was holding its breath right along with us, because everything we'd been afraid to feel was finally blooming into something undeniable. And I could tell he wanted to kiss me again, truly kiss me this time. But instead, he took my hand and said he wanted to show me something before the night ended. So we drove to the old pier where we used to sit after school, where he once told me he hoped I'd never fall for someone who didn't deserve me. And just thinking of that memory now made my chest tighten, because back then I didn't understand he meant himself. He didn't think he deserved me. And maybe that was why he never confessed, because loving me scared him more than losing me ever did. But now everything was different, and as we walked toward the water, he said he needed to explain everything from the beginning, all the messy pieces he had kept hidden, like the fact that before he ever asked Livy out, he tried to tell me he liked me, that he stood outside my house for 20 minutes rehearsing what to say, but my brother told him I was with someone else, and he thought he was too late, so he backed away and convinced himself that Lily was the right choice, the safe choice, the choice that wouldn't destroy our friendship if things went wrong. Yet even while he was with Lily, it was always me, my voice he searched for in a crowd, my laugh he listened for first. And every milestone he reached, he caught himself wishing I had been standing beside him instead. And I felt every word sinking into me, rewriting the years we had lived separately, even while staying side by side. And the wind whipped around us while Ethan stood there trembling slightly, but not from cold, from the weight of truth finally being spoken. Because he said that the moment he realized it wasn't just a teenage crush, but the kind of love people spend lifetimes searching for, he panicked, terrified that if he confessed, I might look at him differently, or worse, not at all. And so he buried everything, convinced that loving me from a distance was safer than risking losing me completely. And then Lily happened, and for a while he forced himself to believe that was enough. But he saw the way Lily looked at me, how she studied my reactions when he made a joke, how she noticed the way he gravitated toward me unconsciously. And over time she asked him one question he could never answer. If he had met us both on the same day, with a completely open heart, who would he have chosen? And Ethan told me he stayed silent, because silence was the only truth he could give her. And Lily, smart and perceptive as she was, realized she had been living in the shadow of a love that wasn't even hers. And that was when everything began to crumble, because love without truth eventually becomes a burden, one that leaves everyone bruised. And when Lily confronted him 2 nights before his flight home, she told him she refused to keep loving someone who was always looking in another direction. And she told him she wasn't angry at me, she was angry at the universe for making her love a man whose heart had already been given away. And hearing that made me feel both grateful and gutted, because Lily deserved a love that chose her without hesitation, the way Ethan was choosing me now. And I asked him how she felt when he told her his decision, and he said she cried, but not like a breakup cry, more like a release, like she had been holding on too tightly to something that hurt, and letting go finally gave her peace. And that thought eased a part of my guilt, but not all of it, because even if she understood, it didn't erase the pain she had lived through. And I told Ethan I needed to be honest too, that part of me still feared we were stepping into something beautiful, built on the ruins of someone else's heart. But he took my face gently in his hands and told me that love isn't a crime, that timing can be cruel, but it doesn't make the love any less true. And I believed him because I had to, because walking away from him now would mean wasting even more years pretending we didn't want each other. And I was done pretending, done being afraid, done letting silence make decisions for me. And when he kissed me, finally, fully, there was no hesitation, no fear, just the overwhelming sense that this was what both of us had been waiting for since the beginning. And as his arms wrapped tightly around me with the kind of determination that promised he wasn't letting go, not again, the world seemed to shift beneath my feet. Because in that moment I realized this wasn't the start of something new, it was the continuation of something that had always been, something love never allowed to die even when we tried to bury it. And when he whispered against my lips that he was home now and he wasn't leaving again, I believed him with every breath I had left. We stayed at the pier for what felt like hours, leaning against the railing and listening to the waves crash against the worn wood, the salt air heavy and grounding. And for the first time since Ethan's confession, I allowed myself to fully breathe, to let the tension that had accumulated over months, even years, finally release. Because the reality of our situation was overwhelming. Ethan had loved me all along. Lily had sacrificed her place in his heart to protect what was mine. And I had spent so long second-guessing every look, every word, every feeling, that this moment felt almost unreal, like stepping into a dream we had both been too afraid to recognize. And Ethan reached for my hand again, holding it as if the very act of touching me could reassure him that none of it was a mirage, that I was real, that we were real, together. And I could feel the heat of his palm, the steady rhythm of his pulse, the unspoken promise that he would never leave this time. And as we walked back to the car, our steps synchronized, I realized how deeply the past had shaped us, how every moment of waiting, every misstep and miscommunication had led us to this precise intersection of timing and truth. And I couldn't help but feel a mix mixture of guilt and gratitude for Lily, for without her selflessness, without her recognition of the unspoken bond Ethan and I shared, we might still be circling each other, trapped in silence and fear. But now she had stepped aside, her heart bruised yet intact, and Ethan's attention, his devotion, his love, was finally unguarded, unafraid, and entirely mine to receive. And as we drove through the quiet streets, the city lights casting long reflections on the windshield, I began to imagine what life would look like with him finally by my side, not as a fantasy, not as stolen moments in shadows, but as a real, tangible life filled with laughter, arguments, late-night conversations that ran until sunrise, mornings where we would share coffee and dreams, afternoons where we would chase the smallest adventures, and nights where simply holding each other would feel like home. And the thought of this ordinary, beautiful, unbroken life made my heart swell with anticipation and fear, because love of this intensity is terrifying. It demands vulnerability, honesty, and courage, and we had both spent years practicing patience in ways that had left us raw and exposed, yet ready. And when we returned to my apartment, Ethan didn't hesitate to cross the threshold with me, holding the door open, letting me step in first, as if respecting my space while simultaneously marking this as our new beginning. And I noticed the smallest details as I settled in, how his eyes softened when they landed on the photographs I had kept of our past adventures, how his voice lowered with warmth and certainty, how his hands sought mine even while unpacking his bags, silently claiming territory without words, silently saying that this was no longer a game, that this was no longer a waiting period. And as we sat together on the couch later, shoulders touching, hands entwined, I realized that the months we had spent waiting for him to return had been a crucible, testing the depth of our feelings, the resilience of our bond, and the clarity of our hearts. And now that he was here, finally choosing me with deliberate intention, the weight of that realization made everything else fade. The past mistakes, the missed opportunities, the pain we had all endured. Because love, when it is true, clears away all illusions, all hesitation, all fear, and it leaves only what matters most. Trust, connection, and the unshakable certainty that no matter what comes next, we would face it together. Not as friends, not as placeholders, not as the what could have been in someone else's life, but as partners who had survived the waiting, survived the confusion, survived the heartbreak of others, and emerged stronger. And as Ethan leaned his forehead against mine, his breath mingling with mine in the quiet of my apartment, he whispered again that he was home. And I finally believed him, because every fiber of my being understood that from this moment onward, nothing could undo the years of longing that had led us here. Nothing could diminish the love that had patiently waited to be claimed. And nothing would ever separate us again.
The days that followed Ethan's return were surreal, every moment feeling simultaneously ordinary and monumental, because the world seemed to rearrange itself around the truth we had finally acknowledged. And each morning when I woke and saw him there, breathing in the same room, I felt a wave of disbelief mixed with a profound relief that it was finally real, that this was not a dream, that I no longer had to hide my feelings, no longer had to measure every laugh, every word, every glance, because love had been claimed openly, honestly, and without pretense. And yet, even as we settled into our newfound closeness, a deep sense of responsibility weighed on us, because we both knew the path that had led us here was paved with sacrifices and heartbreak, particularly Lily's, and I found myself replaying the moments when she had stepped aside, when she had quietly ensured that Ethan and I could reunite without chaos. And though part of me wanted to rush forward, to throw ourselves entirely into what had been denied for so long, another part of me held back, understanding the delicate balance between joy and guilt, between love and conscience. And Ethan seemed to sense it too, because he would pause sometimes, resting his hand over mine and saying softly that acknowledging our past didn't mean we were ungrateful or callous. It simply meant we had survived it, that every choice made, every obstacle endured, had shaped the love that now existed, and the depth of that awareness made every touch, every shared glance, every whispered I love you carry a weight of sincerity and gravity that was almost overwhelming, because this was not the carefree love of youth, but a love tempered by time, hardship, and longing, and the intensity of it threatened to drown me in emotions I had barely allowed myself to feel for years. Yet at the same time it uplifted me, reminded me that patience, endurance, and honesty could produce a connection more profound than any fleeting infatuation or careless attachment. And as the days turned into weeks, Ethan and I began rebuilding the routines of life with one another, sharing meals, returning to favorite cafes, laughing over inside jokes that had lain dormant during his absence, and discovering new ways to connect that felt both thrilling and intimate, because the foundation we had now was built on acknowledgement and choice, rather than circumstance and timing, and each moment reinforced the reality that this love was ours, that no one could take it away, and no one's absence or interference could diminish the years of silent longing that had culminated in this reclamation of our hearts. Yet the echoes of the past still whispered occasionally, subtle reminders of the fragility of happiness, of the complexity of human emotion, of the lives and feelings that intersected and overlapped with ours, and Ethan would sense those moments too, brushing them aside with tender reassurances, gentle words words that reminded me we were conscious of the pain behind our joy, but refused to let it control us. And in the quiet nights that followed, when the city outside fell silent and our apartment became a sanctuary of warmth and shared breath, we would lie together and recount stories of the months apart, laughing at our own insecurities, marveling at the small ways life had nudged us toward this reunion, and marveling at the irony that the very distance meant to separate us had, paradoxically, confirmed the strength of our bond. Because every letter, every message, every fleeting conversation over video calls had built an invisible bridge stronger than any physical proximity could. And the realization of that bridge, solid and unshakable, made the world seem simultaneously vast and intimate, filled with infinite possibilities, and yet narrowed down to the undeniable truth that we belonged to each other, fully, completely, without reservations. And as Ethan rested his head against my shoulder, murmuring that he had never stopped thinking about me, I felt tears slip down my cheeks, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of everything we had endured, the years of waiting, the missteps, the uncertainty, the sacrifices made by everyone who had loved and protected us along the way. And I knew in that moment that this was not the end, but the continuation of a story long overdue, a story we would write together with patience, courage, and an awareness that every heartbeat we shared was a declaration that we had survived, and the love we now nurtured was real, unbreakable, and finally, ours to keep.
After those first few weeks of being together again, every day felt like a revelation, a rediscovery of a bond that had existed quietly for years, but now had room to breathe, to stretch, to flourish without fear. And I noticed the smallest things that made him undeniably Ethan, the way he absent-mindedly brushed his fingers over the spine of my favorite books, the way he laughed at jokes I hadn't even thought were funny, the way he would glance at me mid-sentence to see if I was paying attention, and every glance sent a thrill through me, because it reminded me that this was real, that he had chosen me after all the hesitation, all the waiting, all the fear. And yet the weight of the past lingered, subtle but persistent, like a shadow refusing to leave entirely. And I couldn't forget Lily, couldn't ignore the quiet courage it had taken for her to step aside and protect what she recognized as our connection. And Ethan seemed to understand that as well, because sometimes he would hold me a little tighter, whispering that every step we took forward was made possible by those who had shown selflessness and love in ways we could never repay fully. And it was in those moments I realized how complex love really is, not the fairy tale version where timing and choices always align perfectly, but the messy, intricate human version where hearts intertwine, break, wait, and finally find their way back to each other. And we spent hours talking about everything we had been through, recounting the years of almosts and what-ifs, the silences that had once felt unbearable, the fears we had kept to ourselves. And through it all, Ethan and I laughed at our younger selves, at the absurdity of how long it had taken to realize what was always obvious, at the irony that the person we had both loved and sought after had been each other all along. And our laughter was a kind of release, a cathartic exhalation of all the tension and longing that had accumulated over time. But there were also moments of vulnerability, moments where tears came unbidden as we acknowledged the pain, the loneliness, the fear of loss. And yet, even in that rawness, there was a beauty, because we were finally honest, finally open, finally letting each other in completely. And the world outside our apartment ceased to matter, as if the city itself respected the significance of what was happening in the quiet of our shared space. And nights became sacred, filled with soft touches, whispered confessions, the slow building of intimacy that had been denied to us for so long. And I began to see him not only as the boy who had loved me from a distance, but as the man who had returned with patience, with awareness, with the kind of love that is rare and deliberate and unshakable. And he began to notice the things I had always done for him without expecting recognition, the way I remembered his favorite meals, the way I anticipated his moods, the way I silently carried pieces of him even when we were apart. And he would smile softly, tracing my face with his fingertips, murmuring that he had always felt me there, even when he wasn't brave enough to acknowledge it. And in those moments, I felt the years of waiting, of longing, of suppressed emotion dissolve into something tangible, real, and immeasurably precious, because we had survived the distance, survived the fear, survived the complicated emotions that had surrounded us for so long. And as our love deepened, we began imagining a future together, a future where honesty and presence replaced secrecy and silence, a future where we could build routines, dreams, and memories side by side, a future where we could love fiercely without hesitation, without apology, without the weight of what could have been holding us back. And one evening, as the sunset bled golden light across the city skyline, Ethan took my hand and led me to the rooftop of my apartment building, where the wind whipped gently around us, and the world stretched vast and endless before our eyes. And he dropped to one knee, his voice trembling yet steady, telling me that he had waited his entire life for this moment, that he loved me more than he had ever loved anything, and that he wanted to spend every day proving that love, honoring it, nurturing it. And in that instant, I realized that every tear, every heartbreak, every nearly missed chance had led us here, to a place where the only thing that mattered was the undeniable truth of our hearts. And I said yes without hesitation, not because it was perfect, not because timing had ever been on our side, but because love, finally and fully recognized, had no need for perfection, only courage. And in that embrace, with the wind tangling our hair and the city lights reflecting in our eyes, I understood that our story was no longer about waiting or fear or what-ifs. It was about choosing each other every single day, about stepping forward together into a life we had both fought years to claim. And in that moment, I knew that all the pain and sacrifice had been worth it, because we had finally found the love that had always been ours, the love that would endure, unshakable and true. The days that followed my acceptance of Ethan's proposal were unlike anything I had ever imagined, filled with an intensity of emotion that seemed almost too vast for ordinary life, because every morning I woke to the warmth of his presence beside me, to the sound of his breathing, to the subtle rhythms of a love that had survived absence, fear, and uncertainty. And with each sunrise, the reality of what we had reclaimed settled deeper into my bones, a weightless yet profound certainty that this was ours, entirely, irrevocably. And yet, even in that certainty, I could not ignore the ghosts that lingered, the echoes of the months when he was gone, the quiet sacrifices Lily had made, the silent endurance that had allowed us to reach this point. And as I thought of her, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow filled me, because she had chosen selflessness, had protected a love that was never truly hers, had stepped aside with grace, and in doing so had demonstrated a kind of strength and humanity that humbled me, reminding me that love is not only about possession or desire, but about recognizing what is right, even if it demands personal sacrifice. And Ethan seemed to understand this too, because he often would speak gently of her, acknowledging her courage, expressing a quiet hope that she too would find a love that saw her fully, that cherished her without reservation. And in those conversations, I felt the depth of his heart, the layers of his loyalty and integrity, the evidence that the man who had waited years for me was as remarkable as the boy who had once stood on my doorstep, trembling with unsaid words. And together, we began to rebuild not just our lives, but the narrative of our shared existence, weaving our past into a tapestry of understanding, forgiveness, and joy. And every simple act became monumental, the way he poured coffee just the way I liked it, the way he remembered trivial details I had never noticed about myself, the way he held my hand when we walked through crowded streets, shielding me from the chaos of the world as if nothing else mattered except our connection. And I marveled at the small yet profound realization that true love is not measured in dramatic gestures or perfect timing, but in consistency, in attentiveness, in the unwavering presence of someone who chooses you every single day, even when the world tempts them to falter. And as the months passed, we celebrated milestones both big and small, from quiet dinners at home to spontaneous adventures on weekends, each moment steeped in the gratitude of having finally found each other. And the laughter we shared was richer, deeper, more resonant than I had ever known, because it was tempered by the trials we had endured, by the knowledge that love is precious precisely because it can be lost. And the intimacy we built was not only physical, but emotional, a trust that had been painstakingly earned through patience and vulnerability, through nights of confession, through tears and whispered fears, and the courage to speak the truths we had once hidden. And one evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sun sink into a horizon painted with shades of fire and gold, Ethan spoke of the future in hushed tones, his hand holding mine as if it contained the gravity of his every intention, promising that we would always honor what had brought us here, that we would nurture this love with awareness and care. And in that moment, I realized that this story, our story, was not about the heartbreaks of the past or the timing that had once kept us apart, but about the relentless persistence of two hearts destined for one another, about the courage to wait, to endure, to recognize the love that had been present all along. And as I leaned into him, feeling his heartbeat against mine, I understood that this was the fullness of life, the culmination of every longing, every silent hope, every tear shed in loneliness and anticipation. And our lips met in a kiss that was more than a kiss. It was an affirmation, a promise, a reclaiming of years lost. And as our embrace deepened under the stars, I felt the weight of every obstacle lift, the shadow of every fear dissolve, and the brilliance of what we had endured shine like a beacon illuminating the path we would walk together from now on. Because we had discovered that true love is patient, it is brave, it is steadfast, and it is real. And we were living proof that when hearts are aligned, when timing finally cooperates, when honesty and courage prevail, love not only survives, but thrives. And in the quiet of that night, wrapped in each other's arms, I whispered a vow silently to the universe that no matter what storms may come, no matter what challenges await, I would never take him for granted. I would never forget the years of longing that led to this moment, and I would never allow fear to overshadow the joy of finally being with the person who had loved me first, who had never stopped. And as Ethan held me close, murmuring the same vows with tears in his eyes, I realized that we had not only found each other, we had found home, we had found completeness, we had found a love that would endure. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew that every moment of waiting, every heartache endured, every sacrifice made had been worth it. Because this love, our love, was finally ours in full, unbroken, and everlasting.